before we step into this world. Take a moment to imagine a night sky with no light pollution whatsoever. Not the faint orange glow you might escape to in the countryside, but absolute, primal darkness, broken only by a river of stars so dense it looks like smoke. You are standing somewhere in the ancient Near East, perhaps near the broad floodplains between two rivers whose names you will one day learn as a school child, somewhere around 4,000 or 5,000 years before the Common Era. The air is thick with the smell of river mud, burning dung, and something organic and alive that does not have a clean modern analog. The ground beneath your feet is not soil in the way we imagine it. It is a compressed record of everything human beings have left behind for generations. Ash, bone, broken clay, animal waste, hair, seed husks, and the microscopic residue of 10,000 daily lives pressed together into a surface that your feet read as solid ground. This is the pre-urban world. The world before built its walls, before the first writing systems pressed their marks into wet clay, before the great ziggurat platforms rose above the Mesopotamian plain. Archaeologists call this period the Ubaid and early Chalcolithic, spanning roughly 6,000 to 3,000 years before the Common Era. A stretch of time so vast that the entire recorded history of Greece and Rome fits inside it several times over. And yet, this period left evidence. It left pottery and foundations, grave goods and animal bones, charred seeds and human remains that speak, quietly but precisely, to how people lived, how they suffered, and how they endured. Ancient texts from traditions that emerged later, including the Hebrew scriptures and the apocryphal books that circle their edges, describe this era in terms that are not archaeological, but cosmological. According to these traditions, this was the age before the Great Flood, a time when the boundaries between the human and the divine were understood to be more permeable than they would ever be again. The book of Genesis speaks of a time when extraordinary beings called the Nephilim walked the earth, described in the text as the offspring of unions between the sons of God and the daughters of men, figures of enormous stature and power who populated a world that was, in the telling of these ancient writers, deeply strange. The Book of Enoch, an apocryphal text held as sacred in some traditions and treated as significant cultural literature in others, expands this imagery into elaborate descriptions of antediluvian civilization, of knowledge passed between divine beings and human communities, of agriculture, metalworking, and cosmetic arts introduced to humanity by supernatural teachers. What do we make of these traditions? Not as archaeology, because they are not archaeology, but as cultural memory, as the way human beings at the edge of literacy reached backward into their own deep past and tried to make sense of what they found there. The people who transmitted these stories were themselves separated from the period they described by thousands of years. They were doing what we are doing now, reconstructing a world they could feel in the bones of their traditions, but could not touch. We can hold that effort with genuine respect while also turning to what the earth itself has told us. The people living in the pre-urban Near East, between 4,000 and 6,000 years before the Common Era, were clustered in small settlements, typically along rivers or near reliable springs, because water was not a convenience, but the central organizing fact of existence. A community without water within carrying distance was a community that did not survive. The settlements we have excavated from this period, sites like Tel el-Weli and Eridu in southern Mesopotamia, reveal clusters of mud brick structures arranged around shared spaces with evidence of communal grain storage and animal pens integrated directly into the living area. The distinction we draw between human space and animal space did not exist in any meaningful way. Goats, sheep, and cattle lived close enough to their owners that their body heat contributed to warmth in cooler seasons. and their waste became part of the physical landscape of daily life in ways that modern people would find almost incomprehensible. Water collection in this world meant river water, and river water meant something that bore almost no resemblance to what flows from your tap. The Euphrates and Tigris, in their ancient courses, before millennia of human modification, were powerful, sediment-heavy, seasonally violent rivers whose edges hosted dense populations of waterfowl, fish, insects, and the full spectrum of microbial life that attends any warm, slow-moving shallows. Drinking from these rivers was not a choice made in ignorance. It was the only choice available, and communities adapted to it over generations in ways that modern medical science has only recently begun to fully understand. Gut microbiomes in pre-industrial populations were fundamentally different from ours, shaped by constant exposure to environmental pathogens, parasites, and organisms that would hospitalize a modern person, but that ancient digestive systems had learned to tolerate, partially and imperfectly, at great cost. Parasitic infection was not an occasional misfortune in this world. It was a chronic condition of existence. Analysis of coprolites, fossilized human feces, from sites across the ancient Near East, reveals the presence of intestinal worms, including roundworm and whipworm, as near universal features of ancient gut ecology. These were not animals that lived at the fringes of the body and caused mild discomfort. Heavy worm burdens and the archaeological evidence suggests many individuals carried extremely heavy loads, caused chronic anemia, malnutrition, stunted growth, and immune suppression that compounds the effects of every other illness. A child growing up in a pre-urban settlement near the river was, from the earliest months of life, engaged in a constant immunological negotiation with organisms living inside their own body, drawing nutrients from the same food the child was already struggling to obtain in sufficient quantities. Waste disposal, or rather, the near-total absence of what we would recognize as waste disposal, was the gravitational center around which many of these health challenges orbited. The archaeological record at pre-urban settlements consistently shows what researchers call midden accumulation, the building up of refuse immediately outside and often immediately inside living areas. Food scraps, broken tools, animal bones, ash from cooking fires, and human and animal waste accumulated in layers that eventually became structural features of the settlement mound itself. The tell, that distinctive artificial hill that marks the location of ancient Near Eastern settlements, is made largely of this compressed refuse, generations of daily waste solidified into geography. When you stand on an ancient tell, you are standing on what people threw away, and that is not metaphor, but geology. Hygiene practices in this era were real and meaningful, even if they operated under constraints we can barely imagine. Evidence from slightly later periods that likely reflects much older practices, including early Sumerian texts and Egyptian papyri describing the use of oils, natron, and plant-based cleansing agents, suggests that personal cleanliness was valued as both a practical and a spiritual concern. Oiling the skin was near universal across the ancient Near East, and it was not purely cosmetic. Oils derived from sesame, castor, and various animal fats created a barrier that reduced insect bites, protected against the cracking and infection that came with labor in sun and dust, and carried antimicrobial properties we are still cataloging. Hair was managed using combs, which appear in the archaeological record of this period, in materials ranging from bone to early copper, and the removal of body hair was practiced in various forms across multiple early cultures, understood as both a hygienic measure and a ritual marker. Bathing, as we understand it, was available to those who lived near water, which in the riparian settlements of Mesopotamia meant most people. But bathing in a river shared with livestock with upstream communities disposing of their own waste, with waterfowl and fish and everything else that inhabited those ancient margins, was a complicated negotiation with cleanliness at best. Archaeological remains at some Ubaid period sites do suggest the presence of dedicated washing areas near structures, on small plastered basins or clay-lined depressions that may have been used for ritual or practical washing, though interpreting the function of any specific feature from this era requires honest acknowledgement of uncertainty. We see the shape. We infer the use. We cannot always be certain. Childbirth in this world was the single most dangerous passage a woman could face. Mortality rates for both mother and infant during and immediately after birth were staggering by any modern measure. Skeletal analysis from ancient Near Eastern burial sites routinely reveals high rates of female death in the reproductive years, and the remains of infants and very young children constitute a significant proportion of any pre-urban cemetery assemblage. Midwifery existed certainly, practiced by women whose knowledge was accumulated over generations and passed through oral tradition. But without understanding of infection, without antiseptic practice, without the ability to address complications that are today resolved in minutes, the physical act of bringing life into this world was surrounded by a mortality shadow that shaped every cultural and ritual practice around it. The protective amulets, the invocations to divine figures, the specific postures and herbal preparations described in later cuneiform medical texts almost certainly reflect practices far older than the clay they were pressed into. Death itself was managed with considerable ceremonial care in pre-urban communities. Burials from Ubaid period sites reveal individuals interred with pottery, animal bones suggesting food offerings, and occasionally personal ornaments. The dead were not simply discarded. They were honored in ways that speak to sophisticated beliefs about what follows bodily life, beliefs that varied across communities and that we can only partially reconstruct. What is clear is that even in a world of relentless physical hardship, even among people who are chronically ill, parasitized, nutritionally stressed, and facing survival odds we would find alarming, the interior life was rich enough to insist on ritual, on meaning, on the careful placement of a clay bowl beside a wrapped body in the earth. The biblical and apocryphal traditions that describe this era as one of extraordinary, even supernatural scale, may be doing something more interesting than simply mythologizing. They may be preserving, in the distorted mirror of oral tradition, like a genuine cultural memory of a world that felt enormous, that felt stranger and more powerful than the more organized, literate world that followed it. The Nephilim, whatever their origins in text and tradition, stand for something that many ancient cultures intuited, that the people who came before were different, bigger in some way, more directly connected to forces that later generations could only approach through ritual and intermediary. Whether or not we take that tradition literally, the impulse behind it is recognizable. We too look back at these pre-urban people and feel something like awe. Around 5,500 years ago, the first signs of what would become genuine urban organization began to appear in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia, Eridu, which Sumerian tradition would later describe as the first city ever built. The place where kingship descended from heaven shows a continuous occupation stretching back into the Ubaid period, with a sequence of temples built one atop another on the same sacred spot across thousands of years. The transition from scattered riverside settlement to walled city with centralized granaries, scribal bureaucracy, and organized water management was not a single event, but a slow accumulation of solutions to exactly the problems we have been describing. Sanitation infrastructure, including early drainage channels, appears at some of the earliest true urban sites. The city was, in part, An answer to the mud and the waste and the contaminated water. An attempt to impose organization on the chaotic, beautiful, or lethal landscape of early human settlement. If you want to stand where some of this happened, the site of Eridu in southern Iraq, while difficult to access due to contemporary circumstances, is a real place that archaeologists explored extensively in the mid-20th century. The Great Mound of Abu Shahrain, as it is known locally, rises from the flat desert south of the ancient coastline and contains within its layers the compressed memory of one of humanity's earliest experiments in communal life. What they figured out there, including the relationship between water and disease, between waste and death, between organization and survival, echoes forward into every city that has ever been built since. What remains with you, standing at the edge of what this world was, is not the hardship, as real and unrelenting as it was. It is the persistence. Generation after generation, in bodies compromised by parasites and contaminated water, in shelters that the seasonal floods could erase in an afternoon, in a darkness that was total, in a silence that was filled with things that wanted to eat them. These people built communities, raised children, buried their dead with care, looked up at those incomprehensible skies, and kept going. They handed something forward, not just genes, not just techniques, but the habit of persistence itself, the insistence that the next morning was worth preparing for. That habit is the oldest thing we have inherited, and it reaches back through all the mud and the darkness to hands that were, in every way that matters, our own. If there is an era of early human life you want to explore next, a period of survival or mystery that you have always wanted to understand more deeply, let us know in the comments. These reconstructions exist because you are curious, and your curiosity is the best reason to keep going.